This is the Becoming Muslim podcast at untoislam.com, the show that helps people convert to Islam with hosts from the US, UK, and Australia.
In Islam, it's not just about balancing and caring for the self and for the family and your neighbors, but also about caring for the animals that you live with and, you know, the plants and water and everything else that you need to survive. Thing that people miss is that when the Prophet ﷺ talks about the Day of Judgment, he consistently mentions how the trees and the stones and everything that we lived with, even if they were inanimate, that they are going to testify and speak and you know, tell the truth about what we did. Animals for meat. You also need, you know, fruits and vegetables.
Sure.
But also it's about not killing more than you need to, not, you know, taking more than you need to, and also not eating more than you need to, because we should also not eat until our stomachs are full. You're supposed to leave a certain amount of space in your stomach for oxygen and
So yeah, that's very important. In fact, there's one lady, her name is Temple Grandin. She was diagnosed with autism. You probably haven't heard of her. But she designed, you know, based on the cattle's patterns of movement, because before they would just go down this straight sort of path, and it panicked them when they were on their way to the slaughterhouse, because it wasn't the natural way for them to move. So she made them curve. And so then it became the natural pattern that the cow was used to moving into, so that by the time they got to the entrance of the slaughterhouse, they were calm. So, assalamu alaikum, everyone. We'd like to welcome Sister Nawal.
Assalamu alaikum.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. I'm doing very well, alhamdulillah. So this is what, your fourth interview?
Yeah, I think so.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Wow, you're a seasoned interviewee. That's amazing. So tell us what you'd like to talk about today.
So I thought today we can talk about Islam and its connection to the environment. I feel as if a lot of people forget how much of a importance there is for the environment in our religion, and how in Islam it's not just about balancing and caring for the self and for the family and your neighbors, but also about caring for the animals that you live with and, you know, the plants and water and everything else that you need to survive.
Sure. We all need those things. And I think there's actually, it reminds me of a Native American concept. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but they call it like the seventh generation. So they have to think not only of themselves, but 7 generations into the future. So how is what I'm doing today going to affect not just me and my children and my great-grandchildren, but 7 more generations from themselves? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've actually never heard that, but I'm not surprised that that is a concept in the Native American culture.
Yes, it's something that is very, you know, there are, of course, so many different Native cultures, but I think one of the underlying themes is reverence for the environment.
I feel like Islam has something very similar too, because the Prophet ﷺ did emphasize thinking about, you know, future generations, thinking about your children, and, you know, and I mean, a lot of the context that he mentions it in is in relation to people, but it's also in relation to animals and, you know, plants and everything else as well. And the proof of that is that when he talks about war, he says that we're not allowed to cut down trees in, another person's land, because, trees take a long time to grow. And when you cut them down, you're kind of taking away the sustenance of that community by doing that.
Sure. The community, the people, the community, the animals. Like, for example, we have this in Missouri. So my background is in wildlife management and conservation biology. We have what's called a mature forest. And in Missouri, the mature forest is oak hickory. And to go from like literally nothing, like an empty field where there's no trees or anything in it, to the mature forest, it takes 200 years. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
So you think about that, what he was saying, don't go and cut down someone's trees. Think about the impact if someone did go and do that.
So yeah, and I think it's something that, I think the concept of environmentalism has become such a liberal concept that it's lost all its importance in our religion. And, I do, of course, Muslim people do care about the environment, or at least they should. But I think that the care for it is kind of lacking. And we see this. I mean, I've lived in the Middle East for 8 years. And throughout my 8 years, there was a consistent issue with pollution, with overconsumption, with, overpopulation. And I think for a lot of people, they would forget that it's also their Islamic duty to care for those things too.
And I think perhaps, that you're right. I think it's a little bit different from, say, like I don't know this, I could be wrong because I'm just a new Muslim, but it seems different than from like the quote unquote conservative Christian perspective, is that we've been given dominion over all this. And so we can just use it however we want. And then they can't kind of forget, well, there's also the responsibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And I feel like in Islam that responsibility is in there, that it's like, yes, but we have that responsibility to take care of the environment for ourselves and the future generations. And that there's that sort of difference there in that way.
Yeah. And I mean, actually, in Islam, everything has a certain amount of rights. So, your parents have a certain amount of rights over their children. And, we have a certain amount of rights over our community. And, the biggest thing that people miss is that when the Prophet ﷺ talks about the Day of Judgment, he consistently mentions how the trees and the stones and everything that we lived with, even if they were inanimate, that they are going to testify and speak and tell the truth about what we did.
That is just so fascinating, because I keep thinking about, my role with the Sierra Club. I was actually the conservation committee chair for the state for a year. And some of the things that we came across that people were doing to each other, like there was a company, I'm not going to name them, where we mine a lot of lead in Missouri, one of the largest lead producing states. And this company literally poisoned the drinking water of their own employees. So with arsenic. And, it's like, wow, what kind of witness is that water going to be for them on the Day of Judgment, when they have to own up to the fact that what they did was actually hurting the people who were working for them, just for the sake of profits.
Yeah. And I mean, at least even in water, I mean, there's something alive in there, the cells and the organisms and everything, they're alive. So yeah, they are going to testify, and they are going to say to Allah, we weren't treated very well, or, we weren't taken care of. And I mean, when you really think about that, when you think about the fact that even inanimate objects, or objects we don't give importance to, or think, they have, like trees, because they're silent, we're like, oh yeah, it's just a tree, it's not a big deal. but when you're inflicting harm on that, when people, for example, will take a part of the tree and cut it off or something like that,
Sure,
you
sure.
are inflicting harm. And so that tree is going to, even if in this life it doesn't say anything, but on the day of judgment, it is going to talk about it, and people don't realize it. But trees, just like humans, have communities, and they have families, and they have a way that they live together.
Sure. And I've seen some research on the way that trees communicate with each other, and they're living things. I mean, just because they don't, directly communicate with us doesn't mean they're not living things, because they really are living things, and they're an intricate part of our environment. They're not just a tree. If you look at their role is to, provide oxygen. And we kind of need that. Last I checked. Right?
Yeah. I mean, not just oxygen, they're also homes for many animals as well. And, they're also sustenance for many animals, and as well as humans. So when, as I said, when you cut that down, or when you mistreat that tree, you're, causing a whole community harm. Sure. And that's what that's what's so interesting. Yeah. And that's what's so interesting, that the Prophet actually highlighted that in that hadith, when he says that, these objects are going to testify against you on the day of judgment. I mean, it just shows how much importance there is for us to care for everything that we have.
Yes. And not overconsume that, which, I think is sometimes an easy thing to do. Like, if you think about some of the species that have, and even in the US, that have gone to extinction. There used to be a bird called the passenger pigeon. I don't know if you've heard of the passenger pigeon or not. And there were so many of them. They were like, oh, we're never going to run out of passenger pigeons because there's so many of them. And yet, because people found them delicious, they literally ate them into extinction. So they don't exist anymore. So you think you have a lot of something, but in the end, it has its limits, and you can impact it in such a negative way that it's just not there for future generations.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right. And I think that's what's so interesting, is that when we look at Sunnah and Hadith, like the Prophet hardly ever ate meat. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't eat meat. I mean, we need a balance of everything. And I mean, Islam really does emphasize that, I mean, you don't have, I mean, it's up to you if you don't want to eat meat, but it does emphasize balance. So it does say, you need animals for meat. You also need, fruits and vegetables. But also it's about not killing more than you need to, not, taking more than you need to, and also not eating more than you need to, because we should also not eat until our stomachs are full. You're supposed to leave a certain amount of space in your stomach for oxygen and, water as well.
Sure. A lot of, interesting enough, a lot of research shows that eating until you're full is not healthy for you. Just eat until you are not hungry. And that's it. You don't want to overeat, because, I mean, look at the rising obesity rates we have around the world from overeating. It's not good for us. The result is a lot of increase in diabetes, a lot of heart disease, a shorter span of life for everyone. So
yeah, and I mean, especially meat. Meat takes a long time to digest and process, and it is, a process to raise farm animals.
Sure is.
For consumption. So it's not, as easy as people think. They need also fruit. They also need their own food to be taken care of. They also need to have a healthy amount of space for them to graze, because that also plays into their development and psychology. And we need to. We don't. I mean, in Islam generally, we don't consume animals that are sick, or animals that may be injured.
Sure.
And there's a reason for that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And you also have to realize, and there's been lots of research on this, and listener, you can go out and do the research yourself, that to feed all these animals, it takes more food. We could feed more people by the food that we feed the animals. Like, in order for us to eat them, we could actually use that and end up feeding more people if we just ate less meat. You don't have to be a strict vegetarian to eat less meat. Maybe eat, instead of with every single meal having a filet mignon, just
Mhm.
like, once a meal or once a day have some meat, or once a week have some meat. Because our bodies do need the balance, but we don't have to have meat with every meal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, also the animal community, it requires time. Like, for example, okay, maybe we have a lot of cows or pigs or chickens, but then, we have the opposite issue when it comes to a lot of ocean, life where, we're overfishing and we're taking more fish than we need to. And it does have an effect on the coral and, the plants under the sea or the ocean, and
it really
how
does. It
they
really
thrive.
does. Yeah. And the method of fishing, sometimes also destroys that environment. And so in the end, it's just lose for everyone. You're destroying the environment the fish is living in, therefore they can't reproduce and there can't be more fish. And then you just end up overfishing, and then there's no fish. So, and I find the sad thing is a lot of times it has to do with money. Working in, as a volunteer with the Sierra Club for several years, that was always the case. It was always about what's the bottom line, not about what impact am I having on the environment, what impact is this having on the people, the animals and the trees. That was the last thing on the list.
Yeah, I think it's money, but sometimes it's also just like this type of luxury as well, because I think we're living in a time where everyone wants to feel comfortable. And I think, there's a danger in that, because for some people that comfort isn't eating, fish every day or
filet mignon. I love filet mignon.
Yeah. And the other problem as well is that I think for a lot of people, we live in this world where we go to supermarkets.
Sure.
People don't understand that there's this overproduction of products which is brought into a supermarket. And obviously, if they brought in apples 5 days ago versus the apples they brought in today, most people are going to go for the fresher ones. So what happens to the old ones is they just get thrown out and wasted.
There's a lot of food waste. This is so true. A lot of food waste. And sometimes some of these stores will donate it, but sometimes they won't, because there's all these rules about, well, this is expired. Now we can't let someone use it. So there's that as well. So yeah, I do agree with you. I think there's a lot of overconsumption. And I think that at least in the US, I can't really speak for the rest of the world, there's a lot of emphasis on overconsumption. Like, it's almost like they want you to feel like you're lacking something, so therefore you will buy their product.
Yeah. Well, they've talked about this multiple times in documentaries about how the supermarket, at least in the US and in Europe, the whole idea is to make you feel like there's so much of this. That you have your pick of the litter, kind of.
Sure. Yeah.
And they make a big effort to put wax on those fruits and vegetables to make them look appealing, and to put a lot of them, and to in Europe, I know that they're a little bit more conscious, but in America, at least, usually farmers will throw away a majority of their crops because maybe that apple doesn't have the right shape, or maybe it doesn't have the right color.
Maybe it has a spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a really big problem, because when you look at, how much they end up wasting at the end of the season, it's just, it's tremendous, because it's like that food.
It's a lot of work and a lot of effort put into something that just gets thrown out.
Yep. And it's just due to the aesthetics, and nothing really else. It's not about the taste.
No, the taste is the same. It's just people won't buy it if there's a spot on it.
Yeah. So it's just like this luxurious, this mindset of having like luxury. Yeah.
We're so spoiled. It's the, have it your way world.
Yeah.
At least That's the impression I get sometimes with things. And it just seems to be that it's marketed that way.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't, think about, food doesn't come from the grocery store. It comes from the farms. It comes from the environment. And we have to take care of those things in order to be able to have the food, to have those
Mm-hmm.
things. And the people who put work into that, we don't realize, if you really think about it while you're eating something, you can think about, the sunlight that went into it, the nutrients, the person who worked hard to pick it, the person who's, then packed it up, and then we put it in a car, and then we drove from one state to the other, usually, which I found interesting, and then unpacked it and then put it in a grocery store. There's a lot of people involved in that process.
Yeah.
And a lot of things, and a lot of environmental impact.
Well, that's why there is such a huge difference between, working in agriculture and growing your own food and raising your own animals versus when you're kind of detached from all of that, which is why we're also, it's so interesting how the Quran, many times it talks about nature being a reflection of Allah and being a way to connect with Allah.
Sure.
So, that farming, it is a way for us to be more conscious and to connect with Allah. I mean, think about how much faith you need in Allah to have the right conditions to grow those crops.
Yes. MashaAllah. Yes.
I mean,
yes,
it takes 1
you're right.
second for everything to get destroyed by a hurricane or,
it doesn't take
by
much.
a disease.
It's so true.
In the plants.
Even the smallest things. I have a plum tree, and last year, I swear, I must have, alhamdulillah, picked 600 plums off of that thing. Just little plums. And I thought, this is great. The plums were coming in. I was so excited because I was going to share them again with the sisters. The storm came through, and every single one of those plums fell off the tree. They were blown off. So I got 1 plum this year instead of 600. SubhanAllah. So it doesn't take much. You're right.
Yeah.
So we should be grateful for what we have.
Yeah. And I think we should be more conscientious of those things too. And I'm also reminded of, a story which one of my friends, she, when I lived in Syria, I had a roommate whose father was a farmer. And she told me that when her father passed away, he used to grow lemon trees.
Oh, I love lemon trees. Yeah.
And she told me when he passed away, all the trees actually died the next day. And, everyone in their town or like village was really shocked because they were like, what happened? There was like 300 trees and they all died on the same day. Like, what kind of disease did these plants get, these trees get? Yeah, and it was just due to the fact that, she believes that it's due to the fact that her father had such a bond with these trees. I mean, he had been growing lemon trees for years and, really caring for them and giving them everything that he could. And it was kind of like that link to him had been broken.
Yeah. Like they almost like a shared consciousness in a way. Yeah. That's fascinating.
Well, it brings up the point of how much, you as a person need a connection with Allah to, grow those things. And that's why in Islam, it's also emphasized not just to raise your plants and, grow your food in the right way. Like it emphasizes everything should be from like a good source.
Sure.
But also it talks about, raising your animals well too. I mean, like we can't eat animals that were caged. We can't eat animals that have diseases or were mistreated. And not just that, but when we sacrifice an animal, you're not supposed to kill an animal when it's in panic.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, dear listener, think about that. Think about the nature of our factory farms. Think about the nature of how these animals are treated. They're treated like parts of a machine, like parts of they're not giving their due rights because they're in cramped spaces. Therefore, they have to have antibiotics. Therefore, they have to have, hormones to make them grow faster because we want this to be quick. and living in horrible conditions where sometimes they eat each other. SubhanAllah. That's the condition that most of the meat in the United States is produced under. So yeah, I don't think it falls into that condition. I would say definitely not halal. What would you say?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but it's just interesting, right? That Islam had already highlighted these things. I'm trying to remember because there was an article that I read where it talked about when you kill an animal and it's like not, calmed, that there's something that's released into the blood and it actually like affects the meat.
Yeah, it does. That's what
I'm trying to remember what it was called, but basically that's why there's such an emphasis on calming the animal down and also killing it away from the other animals.
Sure.
So there has to be this concept of mercy in how you're treating the food that's going to go into your own body.
Sure. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. So yeah, that's very important. In fact, there's one lady, her name is Temple Grandin. She was diagnosed with autism. You probably haven't heard of her. But she designed, based on the cattle's patterns of movement, because before they would just go down this straight sort of path, and it panicked them when they were on their way to the slaughterhouse because it wasn't the natural way for them to move. So she made them curve. And so then it became the natural pattern that the cow was used to moving into, so that by the time they got to the entrance of the slaughterhouse, they were calm. So, but it was her autism and her ability to connect in that fashion that allowed her to see, what can I do to help these animals be more calm before they have to die? So, yeah.
SubhanAllah, I've never actually heard that, but that actually makes a lot of sense to me. That you would have to do that. Yeah, because I mean, they also have their own feelings and emotions too, and communities.
And she has, last I heard her talk, she has designed over half of the systems in the United States. Still, though, we still do have a lot of overconsumption of meat. That is still something, overconsumption of not just meat, but of a lot of different things. Yeah. Which impact our environment. Sure.
Well, so on that note of overconsumption, I mean, it's not just about people over-consuming, but it's also about having too many people consuming.
Yes.
Which is another topic in itself.
I mean, it does impact the environment because, we have that sort of mentality of I deserve to have everything the way I want it. In this country, I see that a lot. I don't feel like that's a very Islamic attitude, but I feel like it's very prevalent in this country. And I'm not blaming any one religion or anything. I'm just saying it just seems to be, we're just a very consumeristic culture.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, the whole world is becoming that way now because we have media, which is making everyone believe that they should have everything that they want. But, it's, I think that one of the things I've noticed the most in my years of living outside is that there's this kind of entitled sense of this like entitled kind of understanding of, I have the right to have children and have as many as I want, and not really giving it a lot of thought and effort into what those children require and how having children impacts that community. And I know for a lot of people, this is a very controversial topic because, there's this idea of like in Islam, children are considered like a blessing and, we want to have big families or this or that or whatever. But I think it's also, I think the factor that's missing, and I said this in the beginning too, is that everything has its rights.
Sure.
So if you're having a lot more children, you are going to affect your community, the agriculture, the consumption of animals in that community. You're also going to, and then unfortunately, because of overpopulation now, you're actually also going to not be able to give your children the rights that they deserve either, or give yourself the rights as parents, because children require a lot of time and effort. They require a lot of resources. And I think, you know, a lot of people miss the fact of like, you know, when a woman has 8 children, okay, it's great and wonderful. Fine, she had 8 kids, but did she really give herself the care and love that Allah would want for her by having those kids? Because it's proven that women who do have more children have higher rates of like cancer. They have higher rates of, you know, general weakness and disease. And then the time and effort and energy that you have to give to those children is tremendous.
Yeah. Children require a lot of time, a lot of patience, and each one is different. And it's not, you know, there's actually some research somewhere. We love our children, but having children puts a strain on your marriage. It really does, because some things become more difficult. So Pamela.
And it doesn't even just put it on the marriage too, but even the child itself, because think about it. When you have 10 kids, will all 10 of those kids get the attention that they need from their mother and their father? Will they be able to be clothed and fed and, you know, be taken care of? And that's why there is that concept of it takes a village to raise one child. So think about raising 10 children. You know, how much time and effort does that take? And I think people miss the concept of, it's not that we're saying that children are not a blessing and they're not something that you should have, but it's more about the concept of, is it really necessary to have 10 children based on cultural preferences of having boys, and, or for example, having this concept of like this patriarchal ideology of like a man who's very fertile and can give a lot of children, you know, because a lot of it is that it is this old primitive culture of men feeling like they need to have a lot of children to prove how fertile they are.
But why do we have to prove it? I mean, why? Who are you proving it to? Obviously, you're not doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you're trying to prove something like that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, this stems from obviously 2 things. It stems from the natural biological instinct that, you know, animals and humans have. But we have to remember that, you know, humans are not animals. Like, you know, we don't just breed seasonally and just, you know, to keep
we have technology that we can use to our advantage.
And
surely that's not haram to use that technology. If you know what I mean.
Of course not. Yeah. And I think the other concept as well is that, you know, yes, before, you know, in the times when wars and communities relied on local men to be taking care of the tribe from other, you know, being attacked by other tribes. Yes, there was a little bit more of this necessity of having more children because it was like more hands on the farm, and also due to like higher
it's sort of needed.
Yeah.
It was needed then, and more children died in infancy and young age. They didn't make it. So that was a different sort of world than we have today in most parts. I mean, there are still parts of the world where you still have a high rate of death in infancy. There's a lot of poverty and a lot of difficulties. We ought to help them, you know, in such difficult circumstances as exist, because they're still there. But we have the ability to, you know, to really plan things out more. Well, we have that capability now and decide like, yeah, well, maybe you can have a lot of children, but does it mean you have to? I mean, just because you can do something, does it mean you should do it?
Yeah, not just that, but also, you know, are you really treating yourself the way Allah wants you to treat yourself by having that many children? And then, as I said, you become, because on the day of judgment, let's not forget, those children are going to testify. And mention whether or not their parents gave them the time and the effort, the financial, you know, assistance that they needed, whether they were fed well, cared for well, loved well, because even love is something that takes time and effort to give.
Sure.
It's not,
yeah.
it's free, but it requires energy of some sorts, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of these things, these children are going to, on the day of judgment, talk about it in front of Allah and testify. And then let's not forget the fact that, your community, because if you're living in a community, you have to remember that means more growing crops, more raising of animals. There has to be this enough for it to go around. So
Sure.
it becomes a cycle. You've created this kind of ugly cycle of overproduction and overconsumption.
Sure.
And the earth just can't handle that much. And, it's very interesting because there was always this old concept of, for example, a pregnant woman, that she should not feel stressed out, and she should not have to, work too much when she's pregnant because it can affect the baby.
Sure.
And recently scientists, they did this study where they found out that a woman, when she has depression or any emotional problems during her pregnancy, it actually affects the child.
So sure. I've heard that research. I've heard about that research. I've read about it. The stress of the mother impacts the child in utero, in the womb. So,
So
subhanAllah.
we have to think about the fact of, how much is her physical, it's kind of like, okay, fine, she's stressed out, or, she's physically exhausted. But the thing is, it's not just about her. It's also about that child, because those factors are going to take a toll on the development of that child, which means it becomes more of a burden on the community too, because then, I can say for a fact, my mother, she's Pakistani, and in the Pakistani community, in a lot of the villages, women, they don't, there's like this fear of using birth control, and there's a fear of also like abortion.
Oh yeah.
And there's this concept of like, we should have as many children as possible to better the ummah or whatever, they think. But, also Pakistan has one of the highest rates of children with autism. It's very high. And a part of that is due to the marriages that are happening because of the family genetics being very close. But a part of it is also related to the stress and the way women are treated, and the psychological impact of from the mother on the child. So think about how much you're creating this unhealthy generation by not being conscientious.
Sure. And I kind of wonder, especially with the neurotypical differences that we have been seeing, especially with autism. Autism used to be very rare. It was like 1 in a million. And now in the United States, it's like 1 in 94 kids who have a diagnosis of autism. And it's not because we're better at diagnosing autism. And it's because I feel like there's something in our environment that has changed.
Yeah.
So,
the unhealthy eating, the consistent stress.
There's something there. There really is. There has to be some explanation for this increase in autism. And as a mother, I have a child, my oldest one, who has autism. It can be difficult, but I've also met a lot of people who have autism, who say, I would not have it any other way. This is my superpower. But yes, there is many facets to this issue. But I really feel like there's some sort of environmental something. I just cannot figure out what it is. I don't know.
Yeah. And, it's, in the case that, obviously a mother is pregnant and she has an autistic child, of course, at that moment, we have to view it as a test and view it as a way, we have to find a way to find the blessing and barakah in that. But there comes a point as well where you've become so kind of blind to this that you consistently because let's not forget, it's not just hard on the family, it's hard on the child too.
Sure.
Because they can't express themselves.
They have different
or they can't.
abilities, and having a disability is hard. But mostly I feel like part of it is just, it's the way that the disability is viewed by the outside culture. But that's another topic entirely. But yes, not easy. But raising a child is not easy. It just isn't. Which goes back to the point that you were making, that, to really think about giving each child their due. And if you have so many children, it's hard to do that.
Yeah.
Even if none of them
also
have
Islam
any special
does
needs.
Emphasize,
yeah,
and Islam does emphasize like creating a healthy. It doesn't just say have children. It talks about creating a healthy and good generation. Yes. It emphasizes that specifically. So think about how important that is, that you have to create a healthy and good generation, because the reason why Islam talks about, for example, the mother, being the nurturer and this and that, is because she's trying to instill these good qualities in these children. But if she's not healthy, and the child is not healthy, that's just not going to be very possible. And if there's too much to go around,
very difficult, and you have no one supporting you, that makes it even so much more hard for everybody, and can lead to sometimes to abuse. So we're human beings. We can only take so much stress.
Not to mention the fact that the Prophet also talks about taking care of the orphans.
Yes, exactly.
So really think about that. He even gives priority to these children, because obviously an orphan, by definition, is someone who's lost their parents. So he's emphasizing how much we should be taking care of those kids, and how important that is for a healthy generation as well. And from what I see, there's a lot of, as I said, once again, this patriarchal kind of cultural ideology of like, I want my own children, or I don't want to raise other people's kids, and I want to prove myself as, it's all coming from ego, and it's not coming from a place of being connected to Allah, because that's what it's really about at the end of the day.
Sure, it's about impressing other people, and that in a way is shirk, isn't it? So I think we should be careful about that. It's not about other people. Those people aren't going to be there on Judgment Day saying, "Oh yeah, I just told him he should have like 10 kids because he was trying to impress me with his 10 kids or whatever." They're not going to be there trying to defend your bad choices, right? So they're going to be too busy with their own. We're going to be busy on that day, I think. SubhanAllah. But I see what you're saying. The patriarchal need to have lots of children is really not beneficial for the children or the family.
And I had this one guy that I spoke to one time. He works as a therapist, and he was once mentioning that he even recommends that women, because I think for women too, there's this kind of they feel like they have to prove something by having children. They have to prove that they're fertile, that they could, that they've accomplished something in their life. But the reality, it's so interesting, because when we look at our Islamic history, actually a lot of women in our Islamic history who played really big roles were not mothers. I mean, if you think about that, that's kind of crazy.
But that is a good point. I mean, being a mother is not the only role that a woman can play. It's a beautiful role, and God bless all the mothers out there. But some women don't have that role. Some women choose to not have children. I have friends who are married and they deliberately chose to not have children. But people will ask them, "Why aren't you having any kids?" People will talk, but it's really not anyone else's choices but that particular family's. So, yeah.
Well, also it's very, weird to me that women have been reduced to this idea of like, if she can't reproduce, she's not of value. And so once again, that comes back to the concept of Islam, where in Islam, we had so many women in our history who were never mothers, who never were able to have children. I mean, think about it. Zachariah, his wife couldn't have children.
Yeah, sure.
It was, of course, by the grace of Allah that she was able to have a child when she was 70.
Sure.
And I mean, he prayed for that.
Yeah.
He did pray for that. But,
sure.
We don't see that Zachariah told her, hey, listen, you can't have a kid, so I'm just going to go off and marry someone else.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Find someone else.
Yeah, exactly. That isn't, I know in the Catholic Church that actually is a grounds for divorce. There aren't a lot of grounds for divorce, but that's one of them. If your significant person you marry cannot have kids, you have a right to get an annulment, I believe, or divorce. Don't quote me on that. But I found that interesting because I don't feel like that would be a reason to get a divorce in Islam.
No, but we still find that being a consistent problem. I mean,
a consistent problem, but not explicitly,
no,
out there.
It's not related to like Islam saying that, but it's related to people, because I have seen many men who are like, I don't want to be with this woman because she can't give me children. And what I find so fascinating is that once she does have children, the father's not even there.
Sure. And he's like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. And it just makes you wonder, you were so obsessed with this idea of having kids, but you don't even have the time or the patience or the effort to even give to that child. So what was the point of that?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
And then we look at the Prophet's wives too. I mean, he had 9 wives, and 9 wives, only one of them actually had children. And then they say, Maria as well, but her child had died, but it's so interesting that the same women that we revere and we say like are so important in our Islamic history were only able to do what they did because they didn't have children, and they were able to give their time and effort to the ummah. And Allah made it that way on purpose, of course, but also, I just don't think it's a coincidence, and it also shows that a woman can be more than just a reproducing machine, that she has more value and more to give to the world. And, he explicitly, for those, women specifically, did not give them the right to marry someone after the Prophet. I mean, that's something that's talked about where it says that they cannot marry anyone after the Prophet ﷺ. And there was a specific reason, because, Islam would not have flourished without their time and effort to the community. But I mean, think about that. You're consistently talking about sunnah, it's sunnah, to love kids and view them as barakah and this and that. But it's also sunnah that, that women have to be, and families generally have to be conscientious of the children that they do have, and that having children is not for everyone.
Sure. And that's okay. I think it's okay. And I think it's also okay to have children and also still be able to do other things besides just be a mom. We can play many roles and wear many hats. It shouldn't be like, okay, this is all you are, is a mom. Being a mother is a blessing, and I'm not trying to denigrate that at all. But you can also be, a mother and someone who gives to charity, a mother who has, a way to give back to humanity. And we can give back to humanity in multiple ways as women.
Yeah. So, yeah. It's interesting because my parents, they got divorced. And my mother, she had a lot of issues with neglect because she was neglected as a young girl herself. Yeah. So when, she married my father, she really had a hard time with being a mother towards us. And eventually when they got divorced, we kind of lost our link with her. And my aunt, she had gotten married to my uncle, and they had tried to have children and they couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that I knew really bothered her a lot because she would
Sure.
talk about it. But,
Yeah.
you know, after my parents got divorced, and it was, you know, there was a lot of difficulties with them. My father couldn't raise us, and my mother, she, you know, as I said as well, couldn't really raise us because she just didn't have it in her.
Sure.
And my aunt ended up taking me and my brother and taking care of us. And it was really interesting to me because I think she always felt left out because my mother could have biological children and, you know, all her other relatives could have biological children.
Sure.
And she couldn't. But, you know, later on when, you know, finally my parents got divorced, it was kind of like Allah had given her children, but in another way.
Sure.
You know, it was like she had this role to fill as, and if it wasn't for, you know, my uncle and my aunt, you know, I wouldn't be where I am now because really they did most of the upbringing. I mean, it was them who really, you know, got us on our feet.
Yes. And for her, you know, it was a blessing. She was able to fulfill that role that she had so longed for.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Sometimes there are blessings
there's different ways that it happens. You know, it's not necessary that it be your own kids. And, you know, if it makes anyone feel better, you know, I wouldn't say that I specifically hate my parents, but I can say for a fact that my connection with my parents, it's as if they're strangers in my life. You know, like I don't know anything about my father and my mother. I mean, when I talk to them, it's very distant.
Sure.
And my uncle and my aunt, I can, you know, until now, I remember, you know, she passed away, unfortunately, but I still like remember her smell. You know, I still remember, you know, how she used to do certain things and how she would say certain things and cook certain things. And, you know, it just shows that there's, you know, the biological aspect of mothering or raising children. It's not always that, you know, it's not always there, you know?
Yeah. There's a difference between being the parent and, you know, I think someone called their father, because my husband, that's what I call him. He never knew his own biological father. So he just kind of referred to him as the DNA donor. He was raised by his mother and his stepfather. So, and his stepfather was a father to him. So, you know, there was more to that relationship than just the genetics that some people kind of focus on more. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, these are all things we have to think about because there is this, we have to be very connected and bonded to Allah. And that goes for everything. I mean, you know, we have to, you know, marriage is not for everyone, you know, certain, you know, careers or living in a certain way or whatever it is not for everyone too. I mean, I know that a lot of these things, we feel like they're so important in the community because of societal pressure. And of course the Prophet does, you know, talk about them in a very positive way, but also, you know, as I said, it's just not for everyone. And I think so. The main thing we need to ask in all of this is, what is our calling? You know, what is your calling? So, you know, you can have the best man in front of you for marriage, but you have to really deeply and honestly ask Allah if that marriage is for you, because there's a lot of wonderful people who do get married to each other and you know, they are both really wonderful people, but it doesn't work out.
Yeah, that does happen. SubhanAllah, it does happen sometimes, you know, just it is what it is. We do our best and sometimes it doesn't work and that's okay.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a lesson in there that we have to learn and we wouldn't have learned it any other way. You know, Allah is the best of all planners. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. The key is just, you know, we have to be very aware of Allah in everything we do, from the water we use to, you know, the food we eat to the children we have. You know, they all in theory seem like wonderful things, but it doesn't mean that everyone's meant to have them or everyone's, you know, meant to live in a certain way or be a certain, you know, or be like a mother or father. I mean, sometimes it is just Allah has different plans, and at the end of the day, that's what's important, right? It's not about our pleasures and desires and ego. It's about what is really pleasing to him, and what is best for our faith.
Yeah. So, dear listeners, you can think about that. It's about our connection with Allah, right? It's not about, impressing your next door neighbor I have like 20 kids. It's not about trying to prove to anyone anything. I mean, if anything, I want to prove that I'm worthy of going to Jannah, inshallah, right?
Yeah.
It's that relationship with God. And perhaps it shows in the way we use the gifts that he's given us, the gifts in the environment, the water, the air that we breathe, the trees, everything that we have. These are all gifts to us. And if someone you love very much gives you a gift, right, listener, if someone were to come and give you a gift, here you go, Mom, I got you this beautiful, expensive, crystal vase for as a gift because I love you. Here's the gift. How would you feel if she just took that thing and just broke it? Oh, thanks. I'm going to break it now. I'm just throw it on the floor. I think, we have to realize, what are we doing with the gifts that we have been given? Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. So on that note, it's, I mean, I want to say the same as what you just said. I think we need to really figure out our connection, because the reality is that the way that we've been living our lives for the past, couple of decades, it's not creating a positive environment for the future, for like the future generation. I mean, I feel so bad because, I'm like, I'm going to be 30 soon. And I think about, how crazy it is that certain animals or certain things that I grew up with will no longer exist.
Yeah. This is true. What we're doing now is not sustainable. I mean, it's easy for us to be like, yeah, we're just doing what we want to do, but it's not sustainable for the future, for our children and for our grandchildren, for those 7 generations. We're not thinking about those 7 generations. So.
And unfortunately, the thing that people miss is that those generations are going to also testify against you on the day of judgment, because they are going to say, like,
think about that.
We suffered because this generation didn't care about us, and they did this or they did that, So so you have to think about that. Like, it's not just limited to the people who we think are going to testify against us. It's also future generations. And the only answer you're going to really be able to give is, I did it from a place of ego, or a place of, being selfish.
Sure. A place of, this is easy, so I'm going to do that. I feel like sometimes that is our nature. We want to do what's easy and something we don't have to think about or be conscious of or be aware of. And so we could lose that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we have to be conscious of that connection, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So dear listener, think about that. Think about your impact. You're not alone in this world. You're not alone in a little boat on the ocean. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us, right? He's closer than our jugular vein. We have all these wonderful gifts that he's given us, and we can do so much more, not just for ourselves and our immediate family, but for the whole ummah. Yes?
Not to mention your own family in the future too, because that's also your family.
Exactly. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end?
No, I think that's pretty much it. We really want to talk about, connecting, doing things which are related to the Sunnah, I think we have to really look at everything and not just the things that we like, you know, or that are convenient to us, but actually at everything.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. You know, and I asked the dear listeners, I said, dear listeners, think about where you are every day. We're not in nature. We're in some kind of box, right? You live in a house, you go outside for 5 seconds, you get in another little box with wheels. You drive to your work, you get out of that little box, you get into a bigger box, and you work all day. You come outside for 5 seconds, you get into your little box, and you go home. And then you like go inside and maybe you sit in front of another box. But think about how much we are lacking in that connection with nature and our environment, that maybe we should step out of our little box and just go outside and be with those trees and those rocks and that beauty, and actually see the beauty that is there, that we miss, that we would rather watch on a television or on a YouTube video. So, alhamdulillah, for all the beautiful things that we have been given. We are blessed beyond measure. Alhamdulillah. So, assalamu alaikum. And thank you so much, Jazakallah khair.
Inshallah, we will, I hope this benefits everyone, and Ameen, I hope Ameen. That, you know, it makes everyone think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And anything we might have said in error, that was our error as imperfect human beings. And I ask God's forgiveness for anything that we may have said in error, alhamdulillah. For He is the most beneficent and the most merciful. Ameen.